Chapter 16, in which a priest is dismayed and battle is joined. 3 of you, said Melkorka, Korka, Alverdotir. 3 of you to go into the enemy stronghold and decapitate their leadership. This was a less formal council of war drawn up over a pre-dawn breakfast. The faction leaders were there, as were several other assorted lieutenants and adjutants. They chewed bacon, spooned porridge, and listened. I wasn't planning on decapitation exactly, said Johannes Cabal, but if that's what it takes to put Maleficaris down and keep him down, I'm all for it. Korka looked at him stonily. I think Miss Alverdotir was speaking figuratively, said the professor. Doesn't stop it from being a good idea, said Cabal. And while you are doing this, we shall be dying outside, said Atropos of the sisters. I do not like this plan. Your dying is not actually a necessary part of the plan, said Horst. You should avoid it if you can. The thing is, sooner or later, the Ministerium's forces will have to be faced. Now, even if they lose and are destroyed to the last werewolf and zombie, there is still the means to create more. Inside the castle are the people with those means. If the battle starts to turn against them, we can't expect them just to sit there politely and wait for us to get to them. They will not escape, said Atropos. Ha, Mademoiselle Straka, I do not share your optimism, said Palomer, the Inquisitor. The castle is large and ancient, its perimeter vast. We have good numbers gathered, but we cannot fight their army in the field and still have enough in reserve to surround Harslos. Even if we did, there will be hidden ways out of the castle, and perhaps this Lord of Powers of theirs has magical methods of escape ready too. I like this scheme of theirs. He smiled at them. Specifically, he smiled at Alicia. Sometimes a knife in the back is better than 1,000 rifles on the battleground. They get my vote providing one detail can be explained to me, the timing of the assault. The day or the time? Asked Cabal. Both. Today, an hour before dusk, that is a lot to organize in a few hours, and just before dusk is not so very advantageous to us. It's true, said Melkorka of the Hecadeans. We should attack at dawn. The light of day is our ally. Fascinating, said Cabal, picking a disreputable piece of bacon from his sandwich and casting it aside. It was hard to tell whether the offending morsel or Melkorka's statement was the subject of the comment. You're all used to fighting monsters, lycanthropes, ghouls. Necromancers? Thank you, Horst. You're all used to fighting creatures that are inimical to daylight, and so your attraction to using it without further thought has become calcified. But consider, the Ministerium's main force consists of zombies, which do not especially care what o'clock it is. Their primary support the last 2 outings have been non-terrestrial creatures that seem unconcerned by daylight too. Even the majority of their shape changers, apart from a few of the werewolves, can change as and when they desire, full moon or no. We, on the other hand, have the only vampire in play, unless they've shown remarkable vigor in acquiring one of their homegrown Nosferatu. This seems unlikely to me, not least because Nosferatu are ugly in form, mind, and manner, and will probably attack rather than reason with whoever has to raise them from the dust. This, in contrast to my brother, whose first demand on resurrection was... He gestured to Horst. Trousers, said Horst. Trousers. So I feel sure we have the only vampire, and for all his undoubted blessings, he labors under one major disadvantage. Daylight. He is our ace in the hole, but we are limited in when he can be used. Thus, your attack is scheduled for 1 hour before dusk. When the enemy are fully engaged, then Horst will awaken, and he, Fraulein Bartos, and I shall infiltrate the fortress. Therein, we shall perform the necessary decapitation of the Ministerium. I, for one, am looking forward to it. He's cold, said Palomer to Straka. I like that. She did not reply, but nor did she manifest her usual show of repugnance for the Yellow Inquisitor, so that passed for agreement. Strategically, the aim is to destroy the Ministerium Tenebra in one night. How that will be achieved tactically is what we shall discuss now. I have, said Cabal impressively, a flip chart. Dawn's coming, said Horace sprightly. "I had best be off to bed. Good luck with the planning, everyone." He vanished before anyone could even reply. Plans were laid. As the sky lightened, the train was already preparing to move, and operatives were spreading out across the countryside. Time was short, and there was so very much to do. It took some gentle persuasion that actually was gentle persuasion, and not a euphemism for horrible torture, but Henry Palomer managed to find Father Hornung of the Church of St. Francis in Heidelberg, a town some 20 miles from Krenz. He was not the only one there, but Johannes Cabal and Korka Ulverdottir were also in town on errands of their own. Palomer, however, was a Catholic born and bred, and even if the Vatican had decided that it could, and indeed should, do without the services of the Yellow Inquisition, he would not, and indeed could not, live without Mother Church. So he sought out the Father in humility and respect. That he had to seek him out at all rather than just walking into the church was a demonstration of how the state of Mercarvia was in transition from a nominal monarchy, but in reality a military oligarchy, into its interesting new form as a territarchy, to use the exciting new term coined by Professor Stone. The new ruling class did not care much for churches and the like, places where the wrong god or gods were worshipped. When things had stabilized a little more and the Mercarvian bureaucracy had adjusted to its new form, then the churches, synagogues, and the handful of temples and mosques to be found within its boundaries would be closed, and, where necessary, deconsecrated. As it was, a rigorously enforced worship tax was already in place, causing the closure of all but the most well-attended. The survivors served both to swell the Mercarvian coffers while concentrating the more devout botherers of God into a few well-defined locations for ease of persecution. Even while Palomer bemoaned such a wickedness, Cabal could not help but enjoy the irony of major organized religions suffering a degree of the troubles they had visited so vigorously on others down the centuries. He had joined Palomer after securing a few minor requisites of his own, and now they sat on pew ends about the northern aisle of the church. This particular church was not open to worshippers by mandate of the Red Queen, and the priest had suffered visits from servants of the state to remind him of this. That these servants spoke with Catamenian accents and had emphasized their points with blows was no surprise in these difficult times. "These are perilous times for followers of the faith," said Father Hornung. He looked harried and tired, unshaved for at least a day, and a cut on his cheek still healing from the last time he'd been reminded that Mercarvia's state religion was no longer Christianity, or any of its near relations. "Which faith is that?" asked Cabal. He looked around, affecting to have only just noticed the 700-year-old building in which he was sitting. "Oh, that one. Pardon my interruption. Please, carry on." Hornung gave Cabal a hard look. "Do not mind him," said Palomer. "He cannot help it." Hornung leaned close and whispered, "Apostate?" Palomer smiled and shook his head. "Necromancer." Hornung was thunderstruck. "Here? In the house of God? Impossible!" "If you're going to have a whispered conversation," said Cabal, "you might do better than to hold it in a building with such excellent acoustics." "Yes, Father, I am a necromancer. Yes, I am on consecrated ground, but haven't burst into flames as you so clearly believe I should. Consider this, if you're wrong on a detail such as that, upon what else may you be mistaken?" Cabal was, of course, being entirely disingenuous. Necromancers, as a rule, do catch fire on consecrated ground, as an effect of being divested of their souls. Not all necromancers follow such a path, but most take the plunge in the early stages of their career. Johannes Cabal had done exactly that himself, and, as a result, been forced to dance hotfoot across several stretches of churchland in his time. Unlike most necromancers who make such a sacrifice, however, Cabal's interest in necromancy were analytical, and not simply confined to littering the world with zombies and animated skeletons, the usual highly limited domain of the popular necromancer, which is to say, the highly unpopular necromancer. To him, the lack of a soul had become a burden, alas, not in any metaphysical or poetical sense, but simply because it was a nuisance and caused perturbations in his experiments. Thus, he had gone to some little trouble to recover it. This he did not trouble to tell Father Hornung, both because it would have indicated that Hornung's belief in the ungodliness of necromancers was not entirely unfounded, and also because the mechanism by which Cabal had recovered his own soul involved dealings with Satan himself, and the offhand dooming of a lot of incidental hoi polloi to eternal damnation in the fiery pits of hell. Cabal thought that this latter point would just have led to a lot of tedious moralizing by the priest, so he kept it to himself. Despite such a rhetorical nicety on the part of Cabal, however, Father Hornung did not instantly warm to him. Instead, he pointedly ignored Cabal and spoke to Palomer as if there were no one else present. "I have asked for instructions from the Cardinal, but he no longer replies," said Hornung. "At first, I thought the post was disrupted, just like everything else is in Markarvia these days, but now I hear Cardinal Eder was arrested. Nobody knows where he is. The Vatican has demanded the government explain its actions." Cabal's derisive snort echoed around the pillars and plaster saints. "Sorry," he said. "I just found what you said enormously amusing. Don't mind me." Father Hornung paled beneath his stubble. "You find the Vatican amusing, sir?" "Oh, yes," said Cabal. "Very much so. Verging on hilarious at times." "This is the kind of man your order is allying itself with?" Hornung demanded of Palomer. "You're dining with the devil." "I have a very long spoon, Father," said Palomer, measuring out a length of air between his index fingers to indicate a spoon of remarkable length. Suddenly there was a crash from the roof almost overhead. Something dark flashed down by the window. Father Hornung leapt to his feet. "The devils! They've come!" No, Father," said Cabal in a tone that, if intended as soothing, only succeeded in seeming a little art. "That's our associate." The face of Corca Olverdottir smiled engagingly through a hole that had freshly appeared in the plaster of the roof. "Sorry," she called down. "It got away from me." "How long until you're done?" asked Cabal. "Soon. Already got most of what we'll need. Another 10 minutes? "Thank you," said Cabal. "Who is that woman?" demanded the priest, pointing at the hole with a trembling finger. "What is she doing up there?" "Lead," explained Cabal. "We need some lead. Not very much. No more than 100 weight, I should think. You've got tons of it up there. You'll never even notice that a little bit's gone." He looked at the hole and considered. "Except when it rains." "How dare you?" Father Hornung looked like he might be moved to violence. "How dare you defile this church without—" Cabal rose to look the priest in the eye. "As you seem to be under the impression that the Red Queen is just going to go away if you complain enough, let me disabuse you of that notion. She is not. To the contrary, she will consolidate her grip on this country, and she will expunge all religions except the dark ones in which she is currently comparison shopping. You can't possibly know. She is Lady Orphelia Ninica, daughter of the late Count Maricol." The animosity left the priest's face in a moment, replaced by astonishment. "The Count's daughter? Didn't she die?" "Alas, no." "But no, you're mistaken. She cannot be the Red Queen. The Lady Ninica is just a bit flighty." "No," said Cabal. "She's a sociopath with nothing to lose who is also a bit flighty. We need the lead to stop her. Should we fail, you won't have a church within the space of a year. The forces she is bringing to Markarvia will not tolerate churches." He perceived the unspoken question in Hornung's mind. "Yes, those are exactly the forces I'm talking about. Now, given the alternative, isn't that worth a few damp pews?" Hornung seemed to make up his mind. "I can get a tarpaulin to cover the hole." Cabal smiled, or at least he flexed his face in such a way that the corners of his mouth rose. "Splendid. Pragmatism suits you, Father Hornung. Now, while you're in a cooperative mood, I have a tiny little request to make of you." "What?" said Hornung. He darted a glance at Palomer, who only shrugged. "You want more? Such as?" "Well, in the first instance, do you know where we might lay hands on several large barrels?" "Barrels?" Cabal nodded. "Oh, and a carpenter. And a hearse." The attack came from the west. As the sentries on the ramparts of Harslaw's castle squinted into the setting sun, a force numbering a few hundred appeared around the bend in the river and advanced in skirmishing order on the fortress. It didn't look much like a military operation, and that was entirely deliberate. Careful planning was to be found in the apparent disarray, meant to suggest yet another minor demonstration of the locals' anger at their new overlords. The common folk of Mercarvia were used to tyrants and took it as part of the social contract that they were permitted to mass and shout and string up a couple of magistrates just so long as they ran away into the night and settled themselves, ready to be downtrodden some more as and when the authorities found a gap in their appointments. Their new masters, however, were of a different ilk altogether, and the Mercarvian people, traditionalist all, weren't about to settle for all this newfangled Republic of Occult Evils nonsense without making their feelings felt. This was done every week or two on average, and had settled down into a routine that began with splendid indifference from the muck-mucks in the castle, and finished with a spirited game of Eat the Dissident involving werewolves. The Mercarvian people, long inured to vigorous relations with their ruling class, sensed a tradition forming, and were beginning to think that perhaps the new regime were going to be okay after all. This developing harmony between the suppressed and the suppressors was monitored and quantified by the militaristic minds of the Templars, a contingent of whom had belatedly arrived, the great evil rising from the sands of North Africa having been discovered to be terribly evil, but not so very great, and so they were able to predict that the attack date that had been forced upon them was not such a bad one, as it fell quite neatly upon the sweet spot when the castle authorities would be expecting some trouble from the yokels, yet just before the yokels actually felt quite aggrieved enough to provide it. Into this window of unfulfilled expectation entered the combined forces of several of the world's more benign secret societies, where benign is left open to a degree of interpretation. By and large, they were unused to doing their skulking en masse, but to their credit had adapted well. The Templars formed their heavy infantry, men and a few women, for the order no longer cleaved quite so closely to many of the precepts under which the Templars were formed. The first to go had been the business about never shaving and generally keeping a poor toilette. This, when it became understood that a hairiness is not necessarily next to godliness, and God would prefer to stand upwind if that was all the same to them, who dealt with the enemies in their manifold holy wars with vigor and certainty, or brutality and cruelty, depending on one's viewpoint. They were flanked by the lighter skirmishers of the D Society on their right, and the Yellow Inquisitors to the left. The D Society had already lost most of its best in the failed assault of a month before, and although reinforced by people who absolutely were not, perish the thought, mercenaries hired by the British government and detached British intelligence agents of splendid expendability, they were still under strength. Of Yellow Inquisitors, however, there was no shortage. After centuries of quietly doing the work of the Vatican, often to the great surprise of the Vatican, who had long since forgotten that there had ever been a Yellow Inquisition, this was their grand chance to face evil personified, and they were very much looking forward to sticking a stiletto in its ribs. In an orgy of dead letter drops and secret handshakes, the Inquisitors had been roused from their secretive lives, and they had answered with the cheerful satisfaction of professional torturers and assassins on a busman's holiday. Backing the D Society and the Yellow Inquisition were the witches of the rival cults of Hecate and Medea, respectively, carefully kept separate from one another to no complaints from anyone. The Inquisitors had actually asked to have the humorless sisters at their back, possibly because their business-like demeanor impressed the Inquisitors, but more likely because the Inquisitors found the tight lips and narrowed eyes of the witches inexpressibly amusing. Unlike the better-known Inquisitions, the Yellow had found a sense of humor to make up for the losing papal dispensations, and strolled through life as rapscallions and troubadours, songs in their hearts and thumbscrews in their pockets. There was pleasure to be found in the irony of witches, traditionally wanton and lascivious, and Inquisitors, equally traditional, somber, and duty-bound, swapping their stereotypes. Nor did the Yellow Inquisition mind having witches at their back. They had long since traded in cant and dogma for compromise and pragmatism. They judged by deeds, and the Sisters of Medea had done much good. Some evil here and there, it was true, but nothing on the scale that was the Ministerium Tenebra threatened. Equally, the D Society were content to have their backs covered by the ever-practical Daughters of Hecate. To them, the great mystery of everything was wound up in their witch goddess, a grand dame of the ancient pantheons to whom even Nyarlathotep had been known to bow courteously and hold the door open. And a large part of that mystery could be expressed as, it's all bigger than you can deal with, so why worry? Thus, they carried on through life as agents of Hecate, adhering to principles that wavered between do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and do as thou wilt, and that shall be a fair bit of the law, managing to reconcile Christianity, Thelema, and woolly earth mother beliefs, and the worship of an ancient and unknowable goddess of powers who was also pretty good fun at parties. The Daughters of Hecate could afford to be patient and happy, because no matter who ended up winning the war of creation, it would somehow still be them. In the meantime, they asked themselves daily, what would Hecate do? And then went for the most enjoyable option. In their philosophy, enjoyable did not necessarily mean safe, which was how a force of them came to be there unto the breach. They might die, but at least they'd do it pissing off the forces of seriousness. Whenever a Templar happened to look at them, the Daughters of Hecate would grin back. The Templars always broke eye contact first. That the witches were not in the vanguard was in no way any reflection of their combat worthiness or upon their sex. Rather, it was in their forte, which was the remote bringing down of trouble upon the heads of their foes. They were roughly equivalent to the secret little army's artillery, and therefore kept back where they could do the most good without being distracted in close combat. The castle sentries must have spotted them a good half-mile away, but there was no hue and cry, no alarms and excursions. The sentries watched, drinking tea and eating sandwiches. There was no great hurry, after all. Such events had the air of an over-rehearsed local amateur dramatics performance that had long since lost any likelihood of surprising the audience. Finally, somebody realized the coconut fancies had been left in the guard room, so they sent somebody down to fetch them, who, in passing, remembered to sound the alert. There was no longer the slightest intention of sending human soldiers out to deal with this latest bijou uprising. The guards instead busied themselves taking bets as to how long the attackers would last before routing. The few who did not gamble or were waiting on payday trailed off to ensure the castle's defenses were tight, i.e. the windows were shut. Up on the battlements, they heard an ironic cheer as the newly repaired drawbridge rattled down. This could only mean that the sally was commencing. In days of yore, this would have consisted of a bunch of knights, squires, and assorted varlets boiling out of a sallyport like weevils from a biscuit to disrupt the besieging army, returning smartly before any real resistance could be organized. That was days of yore. Now, the main gate opened, the portcullis rose, and an uninterested horde of zombies staggered out into the early evening. They staggered, and they groaned, and they stuck their arms out in attitudes of deathly menace, but even they, in the last dim glimmerings of their intellect, were getting bored with this. Usually, the irked Mercarvians thought better of it and ran away at the first sight of the undead. Sometimes they would actually engage, lose a few people, and then think better of it. More rarely still, they would engage, make a decent fist of it, but then the lycanthropes run up like the vainglorious windbags they were and steal the glory. One wouldn't have thought there were many fates worse than death, but for the zombies, being dead and upstaged by a bunch of furry bastards fitted the bill precisely. The zombies moved out onto the road on the far side of the river and milled around for a minute, groaning threateningly at one another while they got themselves sorted out. Finally, citing their actual designated victims for the evening's wander, they set off westwards, following the riverbank as they closed on the attackers. If they had possessed a little more tactical sense, they might have wondered why the opposing force was neither advancing nor retreating, but was instead consolidating their line. If the sentries on the battlements had actually been paying much attention, they might have wondered that too, but they were currently preoccupied with getting their fair share of the coconut fancies. The undead came on, arms waving, and only appreciated that something was different on this occasion when there was a solitary crack of a pistol going off in the rear of the besiegers, and a moment later, a green parachute flare floated slowly down, twinkling sickly in the dying light of the sun. The zombies paused, first with confusion, and then to point and coo at this wonder. a small, pretty thing in an afterlife less noteworthy than they had been led to believe. 2 miles away, on a branch line that was now lucky to see a train a week, Denzel and Dennis stood on the footplate of the locomotive, pointing at the new green star in the sky and making ghoulish hoots of happiness. Their afterlife was certainly looking more engaging these days. They'd experienced air travel, been given a new train to drive, and now there was a green star to hoot at. This was indeed paradise. 3 anemopters lined up on the dirt track, running parallel to the track. Miss Virginia Montgomery checked her watch, made an unhappy face, and walked down the row of machines, their engines silent, their pilots standing by them. "This is a hell of a thing we've got ourselves into," she had said to them. "A hell of a thing I have got us into. We've seen what the Black Hats have got lined up, and know they're playing hardball. We know there's going to be some empty seats tomorrow. You signed up with me as aerial performers, not as thieves, not as warriors, sure as hell not as martyrs. If you're going to say we don't have to go, maybe you should have said it before we stole all these guns, bombs, and ammunition," said Dia Boone. She nodded sideways to indicate the opened gun ports with the tips of muzzle shrouds projecting from them, the gleaming rocket racks, the dull black 10-pounder bombs held below the stubby ordnance wings. "Maybe I should have," admitted Miss Montgomery. "But I'm telling you now, anyone wants to stay, I don't blame you, and I won't hold it against you." There was silence. Then Mink picked up her helmet from within the cockpit and started sorting out the chin strap. "We done now? I want to blow up zombies." Horst awoke in a different place. Reaching around himself, he realized he was encased in some sort of metal box about the size of a coffin. The air was close, and he was glad that they didn't have to breathe much these days except for a smidgen for his metabolism, for speech, and for nostalgia, as he held a strong conviction that the box was hermetically sealed. He did not panic, however. He sensed the methodical hand of Johannes at work here, and would trust to his brother's planning. Nor was this trust ill-founded. Some 15 minutes later, as he was working on anagrams of bored vampire, the upper edge of the box to the right of his head was penetrated by a curved steel blade that, after a moment or two's observation as it rocked back and forth, cutting its way through the soft metal of his enclosure, he realized was essentially a large sort of can opener. The metal parted easily, confirming his suspicion that it was lead, and he helped push it open as the blade continued down the length of the box. Horst sat up to discover he had been traveling in a lead-lined coffin. "Very swish," he commented to his brother. Cabal threw down the curved blade and took up his jacket from where he'd thrown it over the tailgate of a horse-drawn hearse. "Your definition of swish has changed over time, I see," he said as he shrugged into the jacket. Horst climbed from the coffin and joined his brother. They were in a gloomy, low-ceilinged vault of some kind. Open stalls ran down either side of the wide and oppressive space. "Where are we?" "The stable, under Croft of Harsloth's castle. The guards are, as predicted, terrified of those they are nominally guarding." He took down a black top hat, its crown circumscribed by a long black silk ribbon that trailed over the rear of the rim. He dusted some lint from it absent-mindedly. A delivery order, signed by Lady Misericord and countersigned by Vicomte Velasco de Osma, was sufficient to cow them. Horst looked at the hearse, the top hat, and then Cabal. "A delivery order?" "For a 3-week-old corpse. Nice and ripe, as I characterized it to the guards. Required for Milady's experiments." Horst looked at the buckled lining. "Hence all the lead." "Both to discourage careful searches and to protect you from daylight should they decide to open the coffin. An unnecessary precaution, as it turns out. A piece of paper with Lady Misericord's name upon it was sufficient to put the fear of God upon them." He sniffed. "I swear, Horst, I've never heard of the woman." Horst smiled. No, in truth, he grinned. "Oh, Johannes, infamy, envy." "Certainly not," snapped Cabal. "Simply stating a fact." He made a show of looking around. "Speaking of women, where has Fräulein Bartos got to? She said she was just going to perform a brief reconnoiter, but that was 15 minutes ago." Horst was delving into the coffin to recover his brother's weapons. These comprised the compact automatic in its shoulder holster and the Webley 577 in a gun belt supplied by the D Society. It rather puts a hole in any pretense of being stealthy if you're seen wandering about with a gun at your hip, he said as he passed them over. Cabal shrugged into the shoulder holster. You're a known enemy, Fräulein Bartos is much the same, and I am an unfamiliar face. I think we can forget about passing ourselves off. At some point, the guards who let us in will start to worry if they've done the right thing and inform their superiors. They may already have done so. I think I should be glad of the extra ammunition that I brought along. He finished strapping in the big military-issue gun belt and was just pulling on his jacket when he became aware of Alicia Bartos at his side. He almost managed to hide a slight jump of surprise, unhappily only almost, so he had the twin humiliations of jumping and an ineffectual dissembling to live down. He dealt with both in his habitual way, applied testiness. If you could spend a little more of your time lurking up on the enemy rather than your allies, madam, perhaps we might stand some small chance of succeeding in this enterprise. She just looked at him with her head tilted slightly to one side as if he were a competent but bland painting in a gallery. Those guards may wonder what happened to us, he persisted. What have you done to find us a route out of here and into the castle proper? They won't be calling anyone. They're dead drunk in the guardroom. Cabal looked at her suspiciously. Are we talking about the same guards? Catamenian fellows, disreputable in many ways, but perfectly sober when we came through? Not with a syringe full of scopolamine and a solution of ethyl alcohol delivered via the carotid artery, they're not. There was a momentary silence. There were 3 of them. Yes, agreed Alicia. I've only got 1 syringe left now. I see, said Cabal. He regarded her as one might a competent but unsettling picture in that same art gallery. I see. Very well. And the reconnaissance? Herman and I mapped as much of the building as we could access. The Ministerium and its lords and lady have some areas we could not reach without causing suspicion. Otherwise, most of the castle is known to us. Very efficient, said Horst. Then to Johannes, Isn't she efficient? Shut up, said Cabal. 2 miles away, a flight of 3 anemopters took to the sky and headed towards Harsloss Castle. 2 CI-650 Guigaros in echelon behind a J-55 Copperhead. Behind them, they left a train. 2 mummified corpses dancing and waving at the rapidly diminishing aircraft, a tired and grim mechanic, and a carriage upon which a sign had once read, Miss Virginia Montgomery's Flying Circus. Now, the last 2 words had been painted over in white, and in the new blankness, a single word had taken their place. In a hasty but pleasing hand, it read in proud black characters, Warbirds.